I guess we'll start with Davis here in Colorado. Pronouns are he, him. Wants to talk about would I die for a lie, referring to Jesus' apostles. This is actually interesting because I had just listened to a podcast on this with some scholars that put kind of doubt to this claim that's professed. So, how you doing?
Hey, I'm doing good. How you doing?
Doing great. So you wanted to ask us if we're willing to die for a lie, or presumably you're talking about the apostles, right?
Yeah. So I actually just kind of wanted to raise up a point I see in the Gospels. Because when you look at the accounts of Jesus' life and his apostles, you see that these people all died these really horrific deaths. There's just 12 followers, and basically, it's really interesting how they actually were willing to give up their lives. They were crucified upside down. They were sawed in half. Some of them were like burned, like brutal, like awful things. And it makes me wonder, like, okay, why would anybody do that if they didn't believe that they truly saw Jesus raised from the dead? If you thought that you were just hallucinating or that there's just some misunderstanding, that you saw Jesus and that his tomb was empty, why would you go through all that and knowing that people are going to revile you, they're going to hate you, they're going to persecute you, if you thought it was a lie that he was raised from the dead? That's kind of the point I wanted to raise up about Jesus.
Sure, but there's kind of an issue, I guess, in some, and maybe Ben might have different points that he wants to come in on, but for me, like, assuming that we're starting with that they would be willing to, like, let's just grant that they believed it, right? They thought that it was true. I mean, you're familiar with people that think homeopathic remedies are going to cure their cancer, right?
Sure.
And they genuinely believe it, right? They're not lying. They're not dying for a lie. They really believe it, and then they die, right? Yeah, so it doesn't seem that, like, the psychological state of your conviction has really anything to do. It's a separate question on whether or not you have good reason, right, to die for that, or that it was even true. So I'm just willing to grant that they probably believed it. But I mean, people believe things all the time and then die for them. People fly planes into buildings because they believe things.
Sure, but if you look at what incentive would they have to die for this lie? Like, everything that they would potentially gain from this is horrible. People would hate them.
Well, here's the problem. So we just said that we'd be willing to grant you that they believed it. So they're not dying for what they know to be a lie. Like, and let's take Jesus's words and that whole story. Like, if you have the promise of an afterlife, a promise that your suffering is going to end and you're going to go somewhere better, and that if you are willing to give up your life on behalf of Jesus, that you are going to be blessed in this afterlife. Like, yeah, if you absolutely believed it, you might be willing to do that. And we have examples of people that have done that. I don't know how familiar you are with something like the Heaven's Gate cult. Like, are you familiar with that story?
I'm not, but I kind of want to focus on what's written in the scriptures, because
but listen, so this is an example going to what you're talking about. So people had this reason, like, believing that the afterlife was there. And if that's what Jesus promises, and death is the gateway to getting to this better existence, it's not a wonder necessarily to say, well, why would I go through that doorway to get there? Why would I allow myself to die? They had this promise. And if they honestly believed it, like we're saying, we're willing to grant you that belief. I can think of that reason of why they would do that.
Okay. So, like, if they believed it, and you're willing to grant that, I mean, we kind of have to ask ourselves, like, why do they have such strong conviction about what they believe? Like, are they just hallucinating, or did all 12 of them really see the risen Christ? And did he really appear to them?
All we know is that they believed it. So, yeah, but here, we have to take this a step. we got to take this a step back, right? For one thing, you're just kind of granting that this is even the case. From my perspective, it looks like, some book says a thing about this, and we still have this investigation on, well, what is the content in the book actually true? Is it the case that disciples were willing to? And me and Ben have been willing to just kind of move past all of that and grant that, but there is a serious contention there, because as Dr. Bart Ehrman's pointed out, that this isn't even something that really has good evidence supporting that we know that they're of their willingness to die. This is just kind of professed through churches and sermons. It's not really backed up with any scholarly expertise or evidence. So that's one thing, but we're willing to go just to grant that and say, look, they believed it to be true. Your argument seems to rest on this. The fact that a bunch of people were convinced of this fact, that it somehow adds probability that the proposition is true. And I think that doesn't make any sense, because for the same reason that people are convinced of homeopathic remedies on probably the scale of millions of people, right? Way more than a few disciples, they're wrong and they genuinely believe it. And they might think that they have good reason to accept it. They might have saw someone take homeopathic remedies and then they didn't get cancer and they made this connection, but there was still this question of whether or not it's actually true. And it just seems like,
Sure.
It seems like special pleading if you're not going to grant the examples that me and Ben are giving, but somehow like look at this one case and go, there's no other case like this, when there's clearly several cases like this. And so I'm just worried that you're going to engage into special pleading.
So I see what you're saying. And I mean, I definitely grant like those arguments, those examples that you give, but there's a big difference in someone saying, oh yeah, I believe that these homeopathic remedies will work. And, I don't really know what the cause of death would be.
What are you talking about? They give up their life for it.
I'm willing
to. What are you talking about? It's not different. They give up their life for it. What are you talking about? They're willing to die. They're willing to die given that experiment that they take, right? Despite medical experts like best judgment.
We kind of have to look at like human incentive, though. I mean, what would they have to gain from dying on that belief that homeopathics are the way to life, like that?
Right. So this actually points out better for what we're trying to say, because we know that people are willing to die for something smaller, like a homeopathic remedy. Like they're willing to risk their existence on something such as, I'm going to take this remedy versus going to the hospital, which is even a smaller consequence than I'm risking my life for the promise of eternity. Like if you weigh these out in terms of incentive, that is incentive. The promise of eternity, if you believe it that strongly, and we see this with our example with flying planes into towers. We see this with our example with Heaven's Gate. We see this with other religious examples of people willing to die for these promises of something better. That is enough. The motivation involved in these religious teachings is incredible. And I think we forget how powerful that motivation is for somebody who actually believes it, right?
Yeah, but like, why would they have any incentive to die if they knew that they were going to die and that's it?
I just told you
for the rest of it.
There's a payoff.
It's momentary suffering, and that's what the whole scripture says. Like you go through and it keeps talking about, well, you're going to be persecuted, but go through that because afterwards you're going to be blessed. You're going to be hated. You're going to maybe be executed. Like the scriptures are full of those examples saying you're going to have this pain, but it's okay because the people who suffer are going to be blessed. And so that is the trade-off.
Yeah, and if I believed I was going to be tortured for 3 days and become the king of everybody, and I believe that, well, one, I know what kind of change that I could do. I could end so much suffering in the world. I'd be willing to take on that 3-day kind of weekend of beating so that I become the king of literally everybody forever. Like that, 3 days of that. Of course I'd have it. If I believe that to be true, I'm going to go through with it. But there's still this question on whether or not it's actually true. If I'm just convinced on a psychological state that it is true, there actually seemingly does seem to be a benefit, right? That's like Ben saying, it's this very small thing that you're giving up for like eternity. You know how minuscule that one experience of like being beat or suffered would be on their own by their own lights, because they're just going to live forever, and that'll be like, I mean, 0.000000, right? And that number will keep just getting astronomically put into the past, right? As each day increases. And I don't see why you couldn't believe that somebody's willing to die for something that pays them out a pretty handsome reward at the end of it, and that they just are gullible people. It just seems obvious to me.
I think you're kind of missing the point of why Jesus died, though. I mean, he didn't die so he could become king. He was already.
Well, no, I'm sorry. I was just using an example of like, I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to get into the Jesus thing. I'm just using an example of like if that was presented to me. But I want to stay focused on on this issue.
Okay, well, even if you see it as just a little exchange, like you have to realize, like in the middle of that exchange, like, man, if you have any shred of doubt that, oh crap, what if I'm doing this and I'm about to literally die and I'll just stop existing forever? Like, you have to have absolute certainty of what you're believing. And the only way you'd have that certainty is if you truly did see it. I mean, humans all think the same way. I wouldn't do that if I thought I was going to die I wouldn't do that unless I truly saw the man and he said, here I am. This is me. I just rose. I just defeated death.
You're so focused on how certain they are. That's just so irrelevant, right? Like, I can be certain that I ate like pancakes for breakfast a week ago. There could be a fact of the matter that I was just wrong, right? My psychological state on how certain I am applies to the person who takes homeopathic remedies. They're extremely certain, right? Or they're more certain than the medical experts, and they're willing to die for that. So I'm failed to see like where it's not analogous, right? It just seems like you want a special plead in the case of the disciples, but you don't want to do it for any other case that we present to you. Like, it's almost like you think that there's only this one case that somebody was willing to die and be certain for it, and it would have to be true, right? Which is just nonsense.
And there's an additional layer here that I think you're ignoring, and the fact that you're kind of taking these disciples as isolated people, when it's not just their certainty in what they believe. They have trust put in other people around them, or people that, like, I mean, if Jesus was a real person, I'm not going to say whether or not he was, but let's say there was a person claiming to be Jesus and all this, and they had immense trust in this particular person. That's another layer that strengthens their certainty, whether or not like they 100% believe something. I think that trust that they're bridging with that other person takes a little bit of that need for 100% certainty off of them. Like, especially if you have people that you've had connections with. Like, I mean, I don't, like, I've never met JMike in person, but I know enough of what I've seen from him on the internet. Like, we've talked behind the scenes like multiple times. So like, I would, have a certain level of trust in JMike if I were to go meet him somewhere. Yeah, there's a risk that he could murder me in a back alley. I maybe wouldn't say that he'd be likely to do that because of what I know about him. But I still could be very wrong in my perception of who JMike is. Mm-hmm. And so I think adding, like, forgetting that layer of trust amongst people who all kind of share these beliefs is something that needs to be accounted for as well. And the psychology of trust and relationships and in belief.
So where do you stand, Davis? We're going to try to move on after this, but where do you stand, and what error do you think we have on this, on our reasoning?
Well, I would just say, with regards to, putting your trust in someone, like, you have to look at why would they make up something like this? Why would people make up a story?
We didn't say that.
Somebody, and then
you have to engage. I know, but Davis, you have to engage with. But Davis, I'm getting mildly frustrated. You have to engage with what we are saying. You're not talking to Schmin and JMike, right? You're talking to Ben and JMike, and you're talking about a point that Spin probably said, but Spin's not here, right? Talk to us about our point. We made this point, and it seems like you keep circling into this. Why would they make it up? We've given you all the toys to play with, and we're showing you that the logic is still faulty here.
Well, that's all I would really have to say about it. It's just, I do see that people make up certain things, and yeah, they can die for them, but you have to look at the incentive, because there's people want to gain something, and
I'm not
nobody
sure
would
you
do that.
listened.
Do that unless you really.
I'm not either. Could
I'm
you
not sure you
steel man
listened.
the position? Like, before we go, would you steel man me? And by steel man, I mean, would you give your best representation of what me and Ben are trying to have a counter to your position on? Could you best try to express what we are saying back to us?
Can you just summarize it a little bit? Because it was kind of long, and I was struggling to track with it.
I'm gonna drop the call, Davis, because I'm not gonna repeat it back to you. Right, you sound like a nice person, but you weren't listening, and it's just kind of disrespectful when we sit there and tell you several times, but you can't even give me like the gist of what the argument was. It sounds like you're thinking about the next thing to say rather than engaging with your interlocutor, and that's just not the way to have a conversation. But Ben, what before I get into some announcements and questions of the week and all that, what's your thoughts?
I mean, it was clear that he wasn't listening, because he went back to the incentive thing, and I've clearly spelled out what their incentive could have been as a counter, and didn't even address that. So yeah, I think we can move on.